Please welcome to the stage Director of the Ronald Reagan Institute, Mr. Roger Zakheim.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Roger Zakheim, as you just heard, Director of the Ronald Reagan Institute, the D.C. office of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. And really, thank you to everybody in the room and those watching online on C-SPAN for joining us for the George P. Shultz Fellow, Dr. Daniel Samet's book launch event. That is worthy of applause. I want to give a special thank you to Tad and Diane Toby and the Shultz family for their support of this fellowship. And I also want to welcome another esteemed guest of the Reagan Institute, our distinguished scholar, Dr. Henry Now. I see Henry, there he is. He is so distinguished we don't even have a chair for him. He's standing in the back. So excited for Daniel. Congratulations to you and to our Director of Scholarly Initiatives, Dr. Anthony Eames. Daniel's book marks another milestone for our Reagan Postdoctoral Visiting Fellows program. And that program funds a one-year fellowship for scholars studying the Reagan era. They come here to the Reagan Institute for a year to revise their dissertation into a book-length manuscript and to get it published. Daniel has done that. More on that in just a moment. His book is titled U.S. Defense Policy Towards Israel, A Cold War History. And it is a subject that I think is quite important and one that happens to be close to my heart. Today, as many of you know, is Yom HaAtzmaut. That's Hebrew for Israel's Independence Day. The state of Israel owes its independence, in part, to the United States of America. And Daniel's book explores the extent to which Israel has maintained its sovereignty over the past 77 years due to the United States of America. It's close to my heart because it happens to be the avenue through which I came to know Ronald Reagan as a child. My father worked in Caspar Weinberger's Pentagon, and part of his portfolio supported the U.S. Israel security relationship. And happens to be that Daniel interviewed the only relevant Zakheim to his book. Now, as I'm sure Daniel will discuss tonight, this book is a realist view of the U.S. Israel security relationship during the Cold War. His book demonstrates that the U.S. Israel relationship is not due to some nefarious lobby. Rather, it is a product of interests of the United States of America. It's an important contribution and highly relevant for this moment. I also happen to believe that the U.S.-Israel relationship is also about values. For Ronald Reagan, it was in the United States' interest to advance American values like freedom and democracy. And as a result, he believed there was a value in a strong and robust U.S.-Israel security relationship. This is what we emphasize here at the Reagan Institute. In 1987, President Reagan said, and I quote, "Israel and the United States have been partners for 40 years. We are brought together by a shared commitment to democracy, to an open society, to individual achievement and economic progress, and to dignity and worth of each and every individual. And we stand together in the defense of these values against those who would destroy them. Our strategic cooperation," President Reagan said, "is proof of that." End quote. Daniel happens to be the first scholar to publish his book while still a fellow at the Reagan Institute. It is a record I hope others will match. and it's a remarkable accomplishment, a testament to his hard work and the quality of his project. So everybody, please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Samet and Dr. Anthony Eames to the stage, where they will engage in a discussion on U.S. defense policy towards Israel, a Cold War history, before opening up to the audience's Q&A. Welcome.
Well, everyone, thank you for joining us here today. This really is a crowning achievement for Daniel, first and foremost, and for, as Roger pointed out, our scholarly initiatives and postdoctoral fellowship program at the Reagan Institute. It has been a real pleasure seeing this develop over your time here, seeing this book come to fruition. You actually realized that ambition that you laid out when we first met and talked about your project, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I'd just like to say thank you to all of you for coming this evening, to family, to friends, to mentors, to colleagues, and a particular thank you to, I believe you both are in the audience, Mr. Dov Zakheim, as Roger said, and to Doug Feith, both of whom kindly took time to be interviewed by a young scholar with lots and lots of questions. Also a thank you to Tad and Diane Toby, the Shultz family, and to the entire Ronald Reagan Institute. Thank you very much for helping make this book possible.
All right, so pleasantries aside, let's sharpen up the elbows a bit. 15 years ago, there's a now infamous book written by John Mearsheimer.
18 years ago.
18 years ago. Good to be precise. The Israel Lobby. And you have some problems with this book.
I do, that's for sure. First of all, the authors, Doctors John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, are very well regarded in their field of international relations. However, in the book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, which came out in 2007, I think they miss the mark, and they miss it considerably. What they argue in that book is that American policy toward Israel has been driven in large part by an Israel lobby, which they define as Americans, largely Jewish but also Christian, who have advocated for things that are not in America's interest, and as a result, the U.S. government has been overly deferential to that lobby and made policies in the Middle East that were largely inimical to American interests. That's what they argue in that book, which again came out in 2007. I remember reading that book and not being terribly persuaded by that argument. What I tried to do first in my dissertation, and now in this published book, was test that against the evidence. Walt and Mearsheimer are very good scholars. However, they did not go into the archives in the way that I did. I wanted to go into the government documents. I wanted to test their argument against what actually happened. I wanted to get into the minds of the American officials, presidents, vice presidents, secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, national security advisors, etc., who actually went about making these policies. What I found confirmed my prejudgment. I thought that the Israel lobby was not going to be nearly as powerful as Walt and Mearsheimer made it out to be. But it went beyond that. In my view, the Israel lobby is actually, I wouldn't say incompetent, but they have very, very little influence. Here's my main takeaway for this evening. I argue in this book that U.S. policy toward Israel has been driven by American strategic interests, which I define in the book as American security, American prosperity, and American liberty. In other words, the Israel lobby has very little influence at all. What really matters, what is really material in this story, is realpolitik. In other words, the hard interests that were of concern to American officials, to American policymakers, to the ones who are driving policies at this time. My findings, I think, really vitiate Mearsheimer's and Walt's. They don't go into the archives. They don't really do much historical research. They use a lot of contemporary examples. I really wanted to put the lie to their argument and also recount this story in a way that's as faithful to the facts as possible. I think I do that here in this book, but you have to read it and be the judge for yourself.
All right, so in pursuit of those strategic interests, we see that that term special comes into play. There's only so many alliances and relationships in U.S. foreign relations that are deemed special. And Israel is the only non-English speaking ally that is kind of awarded that term of special relationship. When did that alliance become a defining relationship in U.S. foreign relations?
One clarification, I wouldn't use the word alliance. The nerds in here will know that alliance typically refers to a country that has entered into a treaty with the United States. Israel's never had a treaty with us of the security kind. I wouldn't use the term alliance, I would use strong security partnership. John F. Kennedy, as far as I know, was the first president to use the term special relationship. He did so in a conversation with Golda Meir in December of 1962. She was foreign minister at the time, as I recall. I want to answer your question, Anthony, by taking us a little back in time. Let's remember that this chronology was really defined by the Cold War. Let's go back to the initial stages of the Cold War. I'm talking the late 1940s and the early 1950s, at the beginning of Israel's existence. The overriding concern, the overriding preoccupation for American strategists, for American policymakers, was the threat from the Soviet Union. As World War II came to an end, there stood only two remaining superpowers in the world: the United States and the Soviet Union. The latter was governed by a radical ideology that called for international socialist revolution everywhere on Earth, including in the United States. That meant it posed an existential threat to the United States and to America's way of life. What American strategists had to do in return to combat this threat was, in one sense, a policy of containment, whereby they wanted to contain, let's call them the Reds, to the Eurasian landmass, make sure they didn't spread their tendrils elsewhere around the world, and let communism collapse as a result of its own contradictions. You had a robust alliance system in Europe and in East Asia, and I wouldn't call it an alliance system, but to a lesser extent, there were security relationships elsewhere around the world. Israel, curiously enough, perhaps some of you don't know, was actually not a security partner of the United States immediately after its founding in 1948. The overriding view in the executive branch, in the US government, and also to a lesser extent in Congress, was that Israel really didn't have a lot to offer the United States. It was a small, poor country. It had really no industrial capacity to speak of. It didn't make anything of value. And frankly, there were a lot more Arabs who were at war with the United States who had something much more valuable in their eyes: energy reserves, namely oil. The bet that the administration, that the United States government wanted to make, was to curry favor with the Arab states, who were enemies of Israel, and really not side with Israel, not be an enemy of it, but not do it any favors, not sell it any weapons, and have limited relations in other areas. The extension of this policy was a moratorium on arms sales, was an arms embargo on Israel. The United States government sold weapons neither to the Arabs nor to the Israelis. The thinking behind this was, in order to have stability, a peace in a Middle East that was full of calm, that was not riven by war, you needed to make sure you were arming neither side. The Israelis, for their part, wanted weapons. They came to the Americans constantly with pleas for weapons. Initially, President Harry Truman and then President Dwight D. Eisenhower refused to sell them any weapons of significance. Selling them weapons, in their view, would fuel war, would fuel an arms race in the Middle East. Again, they wanted stability, because stability, they thought, would keep the Soviets out. If there were wars, the Soviets could come in. Conflict in the Middle East was also bad for American economic interests as well as strategic interests. That was the thinking. The real turning point, I mentioned Kennedy earlier, was in 1962. John F. Kennedy had been in office for a while, and his administration hewed largely to the same line. There were going to be no arms sales to the Israelis and no arms sales to the Arabs either, at least no major arms sales. What really changed the calculation for Kennedy and his administration was the Arabs started getting a lot of weapons from that pesky Soviet Union. They got advanced warplanes, among other things. And the Israelis were really, really frightful. They came, as they often did, to the Americans with requests for weapons, with this new evidence of new advanced Soviet weaponry in their hands. It took the administration a while to come to this conclusion, but after studying the facts, realizing that the Arabs, namely Egypt and Syria, had advanced Soviet weaponry, that posed a big threat to Israel. And if the Arabs were strong and the Israelis were relatively weak, that made war more likely. What Kennedy did at the end of '62 was decide to sell the Israelis the Hawk surface-to-air missile. This was an anti-aircraft missile. At the time, it was state-of-the-art, very advanced stuff, cutting edge. Kennedy said, you know what? The Israelis really need these weapons. My administration has reached that same conclusion. I've got to give it to them. It's the right thing to do as far as our security is concerned, as far as our strategic interests are concerned. I've got to do that. That was really a watershed in U.S.-Israeli relations. Kennedy's immediate successor, Lyndon Johnson, sold the Israelis offensive weaponry. We're talking tanks, as well as advanced warplanes, too. And every subsequent president has sold the Israelis weapons because they reached the same conclusion. It's in our interest to arm them. They're a strategic asset for us. They're relatively aligned with us on most issues. And frankly, there aren't a whole lot of options in the Middle East. It's either the Israelis, the Arabs, the Turks, and the Iranians. That's pretty much it. There weren't a lot of good customers. And in view of the United States government, the Israelis were natural partners for the United States.
So natural partners for the United States, but that doesn't mean there aren't points of tension. There are points of divergent interest between the U.S. and Israel. I mean, there's points of divergent interest between the U.S. and any partner around the world. Why don't you kind of go into some of those moments where the relationship might have been tested but still held strong?
Before I answer this question, Anthony, I want to clarify that I think the return on investment the United States has gotten from this relationship has been pretty good. Sure, the U.S. has spent quite a lot of money on this partnership. They've given the Israelis billions in military aid. I think, though, if you look at this relationship in the grand scheme of things, it was a sensible purchase for the United States. We have gotten an increasingly strong country on our side, both militarily and in recent decades economically, and a pretty reliable partner that has partnered with us on most of, if not all of, the pressing security concerns in question. I want to highlight a few points in tension, though, because what I try to do in this book is really tease out those points of conflict, those points of disagreement, because, as you'll see, it really does put the lie to the view that the Israel lobby has always gotten whatever it's wanted, and it's been successful in pressuring the U.S. government always to adopt pro-Israel positions. That is demonstrably untrue. I already mentioned that there was an arms embargo against Israel under Truman and Eisenhower, initially under Kennedy. That was one point of tension. The second happened under President Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy's immediate successor. Let's go back to June 1967. We are in the midst of the Six-Day War, which for the Israelis was a smashing success. The Egyptians, mostly under their charismatic president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, in the lead up to this war, had been threatening to annihilate Israel, to blow it off the map, to kill everyone inside. Some really, really bellicose rhetoric. The Israelis took matters into their own hands, launched preemptive strikes against the Egyptians and the Syrians, decimated the Egyptian Air Force. It was a tremendous victory for the Israelis militarily. As far as the United States is concerned, it was a rather dark period. There was a spy ship called USS Liberty, which was operating in the Mediterranean Sea and keeping tabs on what was happening in the war and what was going on. The Israelis attacked it. These facts are not in dispute, both by sea and by air. 34 Americans were killed. The Israeli explanation was this attack had been an error. They were unaware the ship was American. They thought it was an Egyptian ship. And officially, the U.S. government accepted that explanation and allowed the Israeli government, or facilitated the transfer from the Israeli government of reparations to the families. Regardless of what happened, that would seem to be a period of deep tension. After all, the Israelis attacked American assets and killed Americans. My view after studying this event is that it was purposeful, and I'm not the only one to reach this conclusion. Dennis Prager, who is a prominent pro-Israel conservative commentator, has also written something to that effect. John Lehman, who was Secretary of the Navy under Ronald Reagan and a big Zionist, a big supporter of Israel, has also reached that same conclusion. I quote him as such in the book. My view is the Israelis didn't want the Americans keeping tabs on what they were doing. In 1956, there was something called the Suez Crisis, in which the United States forced the Israelis and the French and the British to withdraw from Egypt, which they had invaded. The Israelis didn't want to repeat. They wanted to make sure the Americans wouldn't get in the way of their gains on the battlefield, and they decided to attack this ship. In the end, I think Johnson decided it wasn't worth the trouble, and the Israelis were a strategic partner, and that couldn't be bridled by something like the attack on Liberty. Another period of tension happened under Johnson's immediate successor, who was Richard Nixon. Nixon, who, as we all might know, was known for making some pretty prejudicial remarks against Jews, nonetheless had the view that Israel was a strategic asset of the United States, and he wanted to treat it accordingly. But that didn't mean he wouldn't exert pressure on it when he thought he must. I won't get into all the details now, but the U.S. government had agreed to sell the Israelis the F-4 Phantom, which was a spectacular top-of-the-line warplane. And Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, really played politics with that sale and wanted to get concessions from the Israelis, namely to enter into negotiations with the Arabs so there would be no more war. And there was a long period, back and forth quarrel, wrangling between the Americans and the Israelis on this question. Let's fast forward to Nixon's immediate successor, Gerald Ford, who takes over for him in August of 1974. The following year, in 1975, there's something called the reassessment, which meant that the Americans were going to shelve all arms talks with the Israelis to force them to the negotiating table. Again, a lot of tension. The Americans were unafraid to use the leverage they had on the Israelis to get desired policy outcomes. They were not giving them everything they wanted. That couldn't be further from the truth.
So, this has been a good conversation so far, but I have Henry now in the corner, and I also have his voice in my head after working with him for a long time. And he's asking, what about Ronald Reagan? Tell me a little bit about this Reagan relationship in Israel. I mean, it's so central to the special relationship that emerges. There's a lot that happens in the 1980s. Give us a little color to that.
On one hand, Reagan is rightly, in my view, known as being a very pro-Israel president. He was a Zionist at his core. He campaigned in 1979 and 1980 against Jimmy Carter, who was known as being an anti-Israel president. As a strong Zionist, he criticized the Carter administration for treating Israel unfairly. That was his view going in. There were a number of periods of tension, in fact, perhaps some of the deepest periods of tension that I discovered in writing this book. The first one happened pretty soon into Reagan's presidency in June of 1981. The Israelis, to the surprise of the Reagan administration, bombed Iraq's not yet operational nuclear reactor, which was known as OSIRAC, which was constructed with help, we think, from the French, perhaps the Italians too. It was, again, a military successful operation, but the Americans were enraged, at least most of them were. Reagan, in his diary, wrote, "I swear I fear Armageddon is near." I think this was the day of the raid. Reagan thought this could unleash fire and brimstone in the Middle East. He thought the region was perhaps on the precipice of nuclear war. He thought the action was rash, and it did not serve the cause of peace. The administration responded by implementing some fairly tough measures. Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was Reagan's ambassador to the United Nations, had some choice words for the Israelis. The United States supported a resolution of censure, a resolution of condemnation against Israel at the UN, which read something along the lines of, "This did not serve the cause of peace. It was outrageous and unnecessary." And in terms of military, in terms of arms transfers, the United States suspended the delivery, I think, of 4 F-16s. Two punitive measures right there, demonstrably punitive measures. The next period of tension happened the following year, 1982. The Israelis invaded Lebanon, I think, in June of that year in what was called Operation Peace for Galilee. And it was clear early on that they had bit off more than they could chew. They were going all the way into Beirut. It was perhaps an initially feasible operation to root out the PLO, to root out Palestinian terrorists, but then they became bogged down. They got to Beirut. A lot of civilians were being killed. A lot of the sources from the American side are still classified, so I have to go by interviews, newspaper accounts. There are few American sources. What I can tell you is the Americans were incensed, especially Ronald Reagan. He was horrified by the number of civilian casualties, and he and the rest of his administration had some very frank and difficult conversations with the Israelis. They said, this needs to stop. You've bit off more than you can chew. You've got to get out of Beirut. You've got to stop the killing. You've got to wind this down. Things really came to a head with the Sabra and Shatila massacre, which was perpetrated by Christian phalangists against Arabs, against Palestinians and Lebanese Shia. But the Israelis had sat by and watched and didn't do anything to stop the violence. That really pushed Reagan and the rest of his administration over the edge. And they exerted pressure on the Israelis to get out of Beirut and eventually to leave the country, which they did. Another period of tension concerned the Levy. Mr. Dov Zakheim actually wrote a book about this. I won't recapitulate all those details. The Israelis wanted a top-of-the-line fighter of their own to be paid for by American dollars largely. Dov, who was in the Pentagon at the time, and others realized that the program was going to be too expensive. It was a multi-billion-dollar boondoggle. It wouldn't inure to Israeli security, and it wouldn't inure to American security by extension. And the best course of action was for the Israelis to purchase F-16s, which they already had in their inventory. It was a period of deep tension. I think Dov went to Israel a few times and had some uncomfortable conversations with his Israeli counterparts. In the end, thanks to American pressure, in large part, the Israelis voted to kill the program and procure F-16s instead. The last period of tension I want to talk about concerning Israel with Reagan, it happened in 1985 when a relatively low-level intelligence officer by the name of Jonathan Pollard was arrested. Pollard had been paid by the Israeli government to spy on the U.S. government. He, as I said, was working in naval intelligence. If we're looking at the pantheon of worst spies in American history, Bob Hansen, Rick Ames, the Rosenbergs, John Walker, he wouldn't quite rank them there, but he did considerable damage to American intelligence and to American security. Pollard was arrested, tried. He was given a plea deal, but the prosecution argued he violated that plea deal by giving a bunch of interviews, including to Wolf Blitzer, who I think was working at the Jerusalem Post at the time. Pollard was sentenced to life imprisonment by Judge Aubrey Robinson in the District of Columbia, and he was eventually let out, and he was allowed to leave the country when his parole expired. Nonetheless, this really made the Americans upset, the fact that the Israelis would spy on their really only true friend in the world, and it certainly hurt the intelligence sharing relationship for a few years at the very least, although the stakes are very high in these kinds of things. We're talking about questions of war and peace, life and death. Countries are able to let bygones be bygones and work together for the sake of their common interests.
Well, let's talk about some bright spots. We've covered the tension. We've covered the low lights. Let's bring some air to the room in this Independence Day and talk about some bright spots in this relationship.
Strategic planning and security cooperation under Reagan deepened as never before. Again, I'm working with limited declassified evidence, but again, I can tell you that based on the sources I consulted and the people I spoke to, the Israelis and the Americans were working very closely on the Soviet threat, on counterterrorism, and on other threats to their security and threats to their prosperity. There was a naval modernization effort that happened around this time, which was also spearheaded in large part by Dov Zakheim. The Israeli Navy was not a first-rate operation. If you look at a map of Israel and you study their security environment, most of their threats do not come by sea, they come by land and by air. Nonetheless, the Israelis wanted to modernize their navy. The United States, in turn, decided it would inure to our interest by helping them to do so. It was decided that the United States would build their corvettes. These are surface warships meant for coastal defense. The Israelis and the Americans worked pretty closely on this. It was both Dov Zakheim, Secretary of State John Lehman, whom I've already mentioned, and a number of others. That was certainly a bright spot in the relationship. There was also a question that the Americans might build Israel's submarines as well, but as John Lehman told me, the Navy didn't want to because the Israelis needed diesel-electric submarines, not nuclear submarines. The Navy's view was if we built diesel-electric submarines instead of nuclear submarines, we wouldn't get the nuclear submarines the United States needed for its own defenses. It was decided to build diesel-electric submarines for the Israelis. Again, those are, I think, some periods of harmony and shared interests that we saw come to fruition in Reagan's time.
So it's not just the executive, though. We've talked a lot about how presidents interact with the state of Israel. We had the departure point originally of this Israel lobby book as not being the right way to look at that relationship. But Congress has a role in this relationship. You and I have spoken about this time and time again, and I think it's important to kind of flesh that out.
Congress is often overlooked in discussions of foreign policy in general and in discussions of the U.S. Israel relationship in particular. I try to rectify that in bringing some of those voices to the page in this book. Congress, in my view, has been very supportive of Israel, much more supportive than the presidency has been. I think there are a few reasons for that. If you're President of the United States, or you're one of his key officials, or even a relatively mid-level subordinate, you have a lot of concerns on your plate when it comes to national security. You have to be very calculated in how you go about defending this country and how you go about defending American security, American prosperity, and American liberty. And oftentimes, that leads you not to take maximalist positions. Even for somebody like Reagan, who was instinctively pro-Israel, if the facts say otherwise, if your obligations as commander-in-chief lead you to a different direction, you've got to implement policies that are hard to square with how you feel emotionally. That's just the reality of being in the executive branch. Congress, however, often hews to a different line. Again, perhaps a lot of you are familiar with how Congress works. We're talking relatively small staffs. A lot of these members aren't spending all their time or even a lot of their time thinking about foreign policy and national security. They have a lot of things on their plate, a lot of priorities, and they can afford to be maximalists in some of their positions. One member might conclude that he's very pro-Israel. Another might take a more critical view. And if you hew to that line, oftentimes you're going to want to do what you think is the pro-Israel or pro-another country position whenever you must. In this period, I want to talk about a few members who were very influential. On the critical side, there were a few. Senator Fulbright from Arkansas, the namesake of the Fulbright Fellowship, was very critical of Israel, perhaps the most critical senator in question. His view was the Israelis are a strategic encumbrance. We've got to be much more even-handed. We've got to pursue peace above all else. He didn't buy the argument that they were good partners for us. He wanted to make sure that we were spreading our eggs in multiple baskets and not being so reliant on the Israelis. He was one example. There were members of Congress, too, a guy named Paul Finley, a guy named Pete McCluskey. They were also very critical. But by and large, Congress was very supportive. They thought Israel was a good down payment on our security. It wasn't a case of charity. It was an investment in America's interest.
All right, well, I think I'm being a little selfish. I can talk to you about this book at the water cooler or in your office anytime I want. So now is a good time to open this up to audience Q&A. Our colleagues are going to walk around with mics. If you have a question, please raise your hand. If you have a comment, please be respectful and keep it relatively short. And so at this point, please, hands from the audience. And where are the microphones? Naomi, yep, there we go. One on each side. One over here.
Hi, thank you so much for the book. Looking forward to reading it. Accepting the proposition that the Israel lobby isn't what's driving U.S. foreign policy and that it's rational self-interest, I'm curious where that leaves us today and where that self-interest for the United States ends with Israel's relationship. Right? If we seem primarily invested in Israel as an ally in the region that can ensure stability, does that mean we're not actually that concerned, or we shouldn't expect administrations to be that concerned on human rights issues, right? That we're actually not going to force a two-state solution, for instance, or pull out support if we feel that Israel generally should be backed because it's going to be helpful for us regardless of what it might cost us in other areas.
This isn't supposed to be a cop-out. Here tonight, I'm going to play the historian and talk about the evidence I consulted. I'm a little loath to get into more contemporary questions because I would need to have all the evidence in front of me to make a firm determination one way or the other. What I can tell you is that the words human rights, Judeo-Christian values, liberal democracy scarcely appear in the record I consulted. Might be a surprise to some of you, but when these American officials were talking amongst themselves, or even to the Israelis, what really mattered for them was questions of war and peace, of security, of arms sales, of intelligence sharing, of things like that. Which leads me to conclude that the United States didn't support Israel because there are gay pride parades in Tel Aviv, or because it's liberal democracy, and those things may be good in and of themselves, but what really mattered was the fact that Israel was aligned with the United States more or less on the key questions, and it was a good investment for the United States. It was an increasingly strong country militarily and economically, and it's much better to have those countries on our side than against us. It's much better to have them on our side than against us, especially in the Cold War, because it was a zero-sum game. Every country that wasn't on our side was potentially on the Soviet side, and that would potentially make the Soviet Union stronger to our detriment.
I think we have one over here.
Thank you so much for your comments. You mentioned earlier that there was a great deal of cooperation during the Reagan era on Soviet, standing up to the Soviets. But we also see that one of the reasons the Pollard case was so instrumental was not just because he sold intelligence to the Israelis, but because of the Soviet element infiltrating the Israeli government. To what extent was this Cold War dynamic present throughout caused attention behind the scenes throughout the Cold War and with other administrations as well?
I don't have evidence that is not really in the public record on this question. What I will say is that when it came to Pollard, he reportedly did sell manuals that dealt with personnel and methods the United States government used. Obviously, you wouldn't want that in the hands of even a friendly country, because if a friendly country has it, even if they're not going to sell it to anyone, it could end up in nefarious hands. The Soviets get their hands on that. That would not be good for American interests. It was certainly a very negative development in the bilateral relationship. The Americans did not appreciate it. The Israelis, I think, learned their lesson, and they've said in the years since they don't spy on the United States, in the United States anymore. Look, this is a big boys game. Countries spy on each other. That's the reality of world politics, sometimes even on their friends. But the Pollard case was especially harmful to the U.S. Israel relationship, in my view.
We have a couple back here. Let's start from the back row and then move our way up.
Oh, great. Do I hold it? Oh, you hold it. Okay. For question from one Shultz Fellow to another Shultz Fellow. So you make I'm looking forward to reading your book. You make a convincing argument that the U.S. Israeli relationship is based on strategic interests, on effectiveness, on good investments. I guess my question is, how does that? But the U.S. also has during this period, the U.S. also has other important strategic partnerships, alliances, whatnot, all over the world. How does the U.S.-Israeli strategic partnership, whatever you want to call it, interact with these other strategic partnerships that the U.S. has across the world? Are they oftentimes in conflict, or are they aligned? How do they navigate all of this?
There's one, I think, particularly arresting example I want to give you, Will, and that's in October of '73, which I realize I haven't really discussed here tonight. This was the time of the Yom Kippur War, whereby the Egyptians and the Syrians attacked Israel simultaneously, I think, on October 6 of 1973. Unlike in '67, when the Israelis won a resounding victory, the war started in catastrophic fashion for the Israelis. They were losing territory in the north, in the Golan Heights, to the Syrians, and territory to their southwest in the Sinai Peninsula to the Egyptians. After a few days, They came to the Americans and disclosed the extent of their losses, and they were pretty staggering. I remember one conversation between the Israeli ambassador and Henry Kissinger, who at the time was both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, in which Kissinger was flabbergasted that the Israelis had lost 500 takes, something like 49 aircraft, and had expected a quick victory, yet the reality was not that at all. What Nixon decided to do was orchestrate this massive resupply of the Israelis. It was codenamed Operation Nickelgrass. It, according to one figure I consulted, airlifted something like 23,000 tons of materiel to the Israelis, just a staggering number. The idea was, from Nixon's point of view, we can't let the Israelis, in his words, go down the tube. We can't let them lose. If they lose, Egypt and Syria will win. Egypt and Syria are allied with the Soviet Union. That's not good for us. We need to make sure Israel comes out on top. The countervailing interest, if you will, was after this airlift was implemented, the Arab states and OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, decided to impose an oil embargo on the United States and a few of its allies and partners. Even though the United States wasn't terribly reliant on oil from the Arab world, it constituted maybe like in the single digits in terms of American imports abroad, American imports from overseas. It was still not a good development because the price of oil was going up. Allies in Western Europe and in Japan in particular were really feeling the hurt. The Arabs were trying to force a change in American policy by using the oil weapon. What Nixon decided, and his administration concluded as well, was that they were not going to be held hostage by the oil weapon and conciliate the Arabs just because they wanted a change in Middle East policy. Nixon held the line, and of all places, he was praised by the Washington Post editorial board, which was not exactly a pro-Nixon outlet for that position. Their view and the view of the administration was, we can't let our foreign policy, we can't have our key strategic interests be dictated by foreign powers like this. We've got to hold the line.
What a good historian to find that one nice article from the Washington Post on Richard Nixon. So why don't we take a couple questions at a time? And so we'll go to these two gentlemen in the front and then one in the back.
Oh, you can go ahead. Yeah, thanks. Actually, I was going to ask you about Yom Kippur, which you've now gone into detail on. I guess I would ask you, would you characterize that as like the lodestar for strategic interest being what fostered U.S. relations with Israel? And then as an aside, I was wondering if you had in your research uncovered any kind of communications that the administration was having with the Egyptians or the Syrians.
It was certainly an overly dramatic period, and I would encourage you all to read that chapter of mine which deals with this question because it really is dramatic, and I wouldn't say it's a spy novel, but it really gets at the stakes that were involved at this time. In terms of communication with the Egyptians and Syrians, I don't remember, but I'm not sure if we had relations with either party at this time. I don't know, I could be mistaken on that question. But the idea was, at least from the Egyptians' point of view, it was no longer Nasser who was president. A new fellow by the name of Anwar Sadat had come in. Both the Egyptians and the Syrians wanted to take back territory they had lost from the Israelis in '67. I'm not sure if they knew that they could win or they believed they could win. Perhaps not. I'd have to ask people who've looked at this question in depth. But they wanted to acquire enough land to have a stronger position at the negotiating table. I didn't find a whole lot in terms of communications with the Egyptians and Syrians from the U.S. side during this time. What did happen was Kissinger was dispatched to Moscow to work out the details of a ceasefire proposal to be proposed in the United Nations, because toward the end of the war, when the Israelis had turned the tide and were beating back both the Syrians and the Egyptians and came really close to Cairo, actually, the Soviets didn't want the Israelis to get to Cairo and perhaps oust the Egyptian regime. That would be calamitous for their interests. They brought Kissinger to Moscow. There was a deal that was worked out. There was a ceasefire that was proposed at the United Nations Security Council, and the war ended.
And I think we have time for one more, this gentleman in the front. And then do know that everyone can pick up their copy of Daniel's book, and he'll sign it for you and answer even more questions if you have them over here at the booth after this question.
Thanks. During the course of your research, was there a particular moment in the history of the Cold War relationship between the United States and Israel that you think American policymakers could learn from, given the situation in the Middle East right now?
It's a good question, Zach. Again, I'm loath really to wade in this venue on contemporary questions. I do want to tease out, in addition to October 73, which I think was highly consequential and was a high point in U.S. Israel relations in terms of the positive side of things, I want to bring to the table something else that happened under Reagan that I was remiss in mentioning, which was the AWACS sale in 1981. At the time, this was a politically charged subject. It was all in the news. Today, it's largely forgotten because we're now 44 years past that point. What the Reagan administration wanted to do was sell the AWACS system, which was an early warning airborne reconnaissance system, to the Saudis. The Israel lobby was up in arms. They saw this as an existential threat to Israel, even though the Saudis hadn't, to my knowledge, fought the Israelis in any significant numbers. They were still nominally enemies. They didn't wish the Israelis well. And there also was a lot of lingering anger over that Arab oil embargo from a number of years earlier in the 1970s. Reagan decided that he needed the Saudis on our side. He needed them in the American camp. And AWACS was the price of that. He was going to persist regardless of what the Israel lobby did or said. They were able to bring pressure to bear on Congress, and they actually got enough members in the House to vote to kill the AWACS sale. But yet in the Senate, the administration spent all of its political capital and was able to defeat that resolution disapproval, which would have killed the sale by a 52-48 margin, if I'm not mistaken. And the lobby lost. The administration won on this question. If you're trying to apply that to contemporary questions, I would say perhaps something like negotiations about Iran today, in which the administration has one view, the Israeli government perhaps has another, and you have to work it out. And sometimes the U.S. government does something that the Israelis don't want. It's not the preferred policy. But in the end, the U.S. government is always going to do what it thinks it's in its own interests. Likewise, the Israelis are going to do what they think is in their interests.
Well, I think that's a good question to close on, since we got a little bit of Ronald Reagan in there at the end. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Dr. Samet and congratulating him on this wonderful book.